Why does the Vatican fear Mary Magdalene? Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, where today we're going to be discussing why the Vatican is afraid of Mary Magdalene's legacy. Now let's get started. The year 2020 will go down in history as the year when the Catholic Church was forced to confront one of its most controversial figures, Mary Magdalene. In March of that year, a collection of handwritten documents known as the Secret Vatican Scrolls were leaked to the media, detailing the Church's efforts to suppress any mention of Mary Magdalene in scripture or tradition. The scrolls paint a picture of an institution terrified at the prospect of Mary Magdalene's legacy being reclaimed by those who believe she was Jesus Christ's wife and the mother of his child. What exactly is so dangerous about Mary Magdalene's legacy for the Catholic Church? And how does it threaten their authority if they allowed her story to be told? To understand this, we must first take a closer look at Mary Magdalene herself. Mary Magdalene is one of the most enigmatic figures in religious history. Her story is shrouded in mystery, and there are conflicting accounts of who she was and what role she played during the life and death of Jesus Christ. While some believe she was nothing more than a repentant prostitute, others argue that she was actually Jesus' wife and the mother of his child. This latter view is supported by several early Christian texts, including the Gospel of Philip, which state that Mary Magdalene was the companion of Jesus and that they had a special relationship that went beyond that of ordinary discipleship. These texts also claim that Mary Magdalene was misunderstood by later Christians who sought to demonize her because of her close relationship with Jesus. However, the Catholic Church has traditionally rejected these claims, insisting that Mary Magdalene was nothing more than a repentant sinner who was saved by Jesus' love and forgiveness. Despite this official church teaching, there is evidence that many Christians during the early centuries believed that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' wife and the mother of his child. For example, the writings of the Gnostics, a diverse group of early Christians who held different beliefs than the Church, contain numerous references to Mary Magdalene as the companion of Jesus. Some Gnostic texts even claim that Mary Magdalene was the first bishop of the Church after Jesus' death and resurrection. So why did the Catholic Church feel compelled to suppress these teachings about Mary Magdalene? One possible explanation is that the Church was concerned that acknowledging Mary Magdalene's special status would undermine its own authority. If it were true that Jesus had been married and had children, then the Church's claim to be the one true path to salvation would be weakened. Additionally, allowing women to hold positions of power within the Church would have been seen as a threat to the patriarchal authority that had been established by the time of the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Therefore, in order to maintain its power and influence, the Church actively worked to erase any mention of Mary Magdalene from its records and writings. To further solidify this narrative, the Catholic Church used its control over the production and distribution of religious texts to ensure that only accounts which portrayed Mary Magdalene in a negative light were widely circulated. This effort was aided by the fact that many of the early Christian writings, including the Gospel of Philip, were written in Coptic, ancient Egyptian language, which limited their accessibility to a wider audience. By controlling the means of production and dissemination of religious texts, the Church was able to shape the way that Mary Magdalene was perceived throughout history. The Catholic Church's campaign against Mary Magdalene did not end with the suppression of early Christian texts. The Church also actively worked to prevent the spread of oral traditions which celebrated Mary Magdalene as the wife of Jesus. For example, in the 12th century, the writer Dan Brown's novel The Da Vinci Code brought renewed attention to the controversial figure. The novel, which was later adapted into a popular film, presented a fictional account of Mary Magdalene's life and claimed that she and Jesus had a romantic relationship. Although the novel was met with widespread criticism from religious leaders and scholars alike, it nevertheless sparked public interest in Mary Magdalene and her potential role in Christian history. This renewed interest in Mary Magdalene led to calls for the Catholic Church to release documents related to her life and relationship with Jesus, if they existed. However, the Church has resisted these calls for transparency, citing various reasons for its reluctance to make such documents public. Church officials have argued that many of the documents may be too obscure or irrelevant to warrant release, and that making them public could cause confusion or distort public understanding of Church teachings. Additionally, the Church has expressed concern that the release of such documents could lead to further sensationalism and speculation about Mary Magdalene's life, rather than providing clear answers or historical insights. But critics of the Church argue that its reluctance to release documents related to Mary Magdalene is nothing more than an attempt to cover up evidence that could threaten its authority. They point out that the Church has been remarkably consistent in its efforts to suppress any mention of Mary Magdalene, dating back to the early centuries of Christianity. Furthermore, the Church's claims that many documents are too obscure or irrelevant to warrant release have been called into question by scholars, who argue that even obscure or seemingly irrelevant documents can provide valuable insights into the history of Christianity and should therefore be made available to the public. In recent years, however, the Catholic Church has begun to relent slightly in its stance on the release of Mary Magdalene-related documents. In 2018, Pope Francis ordered the release of hundreds of previously confidential church documents, including some related to Mary Magdalene. However, despite this development, much of the information contained within these documents remains hidden from the public eye. Many scholars and researchers have been granted access to study the documents firsthand, but the information contained within them is not yet available for broader public consumption. This limited access has been seen by some as an attempt by the Church to control the narrative surrounding Mary Magdalene and prevent the widespread dissemination of information that could be damaging to its reputation or authority. Critics of the Church's handling of Mary Magdalene-related documents argued that the Church's reluctance to release them is nothing more than an attempt to cover up evidence that could threaten its authority. They point out that the Church has been remarkably consistent in its efforts to suppress any mention of Mary Magdalene, dating back to the early centuries of Christianity. The Church's claims that many documents are too obscure or irrelevant to warrant release have been called into question by scholars, who argue that even obscure or seemingly irrelevant documents can provide valuable insights into the history of Christianity and should therefore be made available to the public. As the debate over Mary Magdalene's legacy continues, it remains to be seen whether the Catholic Church will eventually release all of its documents related to her life and relationship with Jesus. If so, it could provide invaluable insights into the history of Christianity and help us better understand the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. However, until that time comes, we can only speculate about what the Church is hiding and why it fears the release of such documents. So why does the Vatican fear Mary Magdalene's legacy? There are several reasons why the Vatican may fear the implications of recognizing Mary Magdalene's legacy. First and foremost, acknowledging Mary Magdalene's special status and her close relationship with Jesus could potentially undermine the Catholic Church's authority. If it were proven that Jesus was married and had children, it could challenge the Church's traditional teachings on Jesus' divinity and the nature of his mission. This could lead to a weakening of the Church's authority and a questioning of its interpretation of Christian teachings. Furthermore, recognizing Mary Magdalene's legacy could threaten the Church's historical narrative and its claims to continuity from the early Church. By suppressing writings and traditions that celebrate Mary Magdalene, the Church has been able to shape the dominant narrative of Jesus' life and teachings. Allowing alternative narratives to emerge could call into question the Church's version of events and challenge its claims to historical accuracy. Finally, recognizing Mary Magdalene's legacy could lead to a re-evaluation of the Church's role in society and its relationship to women. As a woman who held a prominent place in early Christian communities and potentially even led them, Mary Magdalene represents a challenge to the Church's patriarchal authority. Allowing her legacy to be reclaimed could inspire calls for greater gender equality within the Church and society more broadly. Overall, the Vatican's fear of Mary Magdalene's legacy stems from the potential implications for its authority, its historical narrative, and the status of women in society. By continuing to suppress writings and traditions related to Mary Magdalene, the Church is able to maintain control over the narrative of Jesus' life and teachings, and protect its own power and influence. And that's all for today. Please remember to like and subscribe so you never miss another one of our videos. Until next time, stay curious.